This is Unit 2 DIY for Level 2, Standard 6-5W2. The assignment's called Simple and Compound Sentences. First things first, you always need to put your name on your paper. Don't forget, because you definitely want to have that grade. You don't want to get a 0 for not putting your name on it. Let's look at this very first part. It says, a simple sentence has one subject and one predicate. So let's look at our examples. This first one says, Natalie won the marbles tournament. Natalie is our one subject. The predicate is won. Our second example, Bill and Edward signed up for the paper drive. Bill and Edward are our one simple subject, and signed is our simple predicate. Our third example says, the runners lined up and waited for the starting signal. The runners is our simple subject. Lined up and waited for the starting signal. Lined and waited are our simple predicate. A compound sentence contains two or more simple sentences joined by a comma and, but, or. They can also be joined by a semicolon, which looks just like this. So let's look at our first example. It says, Jessica's cake won first prize, comma, and Catherine won the sack race. Go ahead and circle comma and. If we look at what's before comma and, we have Jessica's cake won first prize, which is a simple sentence. If we find our verb, put our line, underline our simple subject, which is cake, and underline twice our predicate, our simple predicate, twice, we have one subject, one predicate. Now let's look on the other side of comma and. We have Catherine won the sack race. That's also a simple sentence, because if we find our verb, which is won, put our line, we have Catherine as our simple subject and won as our simple predicate. So we have two simple sentences that are combined by comma and. If we look at our second example, it's the exact same compound sentence, but instead of putting comma and, they used a semicolon. Both are correct. So let's look at exercise 1. Our directions say write S in the blank before each simple sentence and C before each compound sentence. Let's look at our example. Our example says, you and I should go to the fair and see the sights. If we find our verb, which is go, and put our line, you can see that we have a compound subject, which is you and I. If we look at our predicate, you can see we have also a compound predicate. Go and see are our simple predicates. We know that they're compound because we have and that separates the two subjects and separates the two predicates. Since there is no comma and, comma, or, comma, but, or a semicolon, it's a simple sentence. Remember, to help you find your verbs, verbs show action, or it can tell what the subject is or is like. So let's look at number 1 through 3. We're going to do this together. Number 1, both adults and kids love to go to the fair. Let's find our verb. Our verb is an action, which is love. Let's put our line right there. We've split our sentence into 2. Now we have and. That splits adults and kids, which are our subjects. So we have a compound simple subject, adults, kids. On the other side of our line, we only have one verb, which is love. That's our simple predicate. Again, we do not have comma and, comma or, comma but, or a semicolon, so it's a simple sentence. Now let's look at number 2. It says, you buy the tickets and I'll get the popcorn. Right off, we can see that there's a comma and. So let's make sure it's correctly used. Look at the sentence before comma, and it says, you buy the tickets. Buy is our action. So if we put our line here, we can see we have one subject and one predicate. On the other side of comma and, it says, I'll get the popcorn. Our action is get, so we're going to put our line. We have one subject, which is I'll, and one predicate, which is get. So we have 2 simple sentences connected together using comma and. That's a compound sentence. Now look at number 3. It says, the animals are over there, comma and, the crafts are down this way. Again, we have comma and. Go ahead and circle that. Let's look at the sentence before comma. It says, the animals are over there. Right? We have are as our verb. Let's put our line. And we have one subject, which is animals, and we have one predicate, which is are. Now let's look on the other side. The crafts are down this way. Again, we have are as our verb. Put your line. Crafts is our subject. Are is our predicate. We have 2 simple sentences combined by comma and, so it makes it a compound sentence. At this point, go ahead and pause the video, and you want to finish 4 through 15 before turning to the back. The second half of this DIY is over complex sentences and subordinate clauses. Let's look at the very first part. It says, a complex sentence has a main clause and one or more subordinate clauses. A main clause has a subject and a predicate, and it can stand alone as a sentence. A subordinate clause also has a subject and a predicate, but it cannot stand alone as a sentence, meaning that it would be a sentence fragment. It depends on the main clause to complete its meaning. So a subordinate clause has to have the main clause so that the sentence makes sense. It can act as an adjective, an adverb, or a noun. If you don't know what those things are, an adjective describes things. Nouns are or can be a person, place, thing, or idea. And adverbs modify a verb, meaning that it adds to the verb. Let's look at our examples. Our first one right here says they are playing music that I like to hear. So we have they are playing music, which can stand alone as a sentence itself. If we were to only look at the second part of this that says that I like to hear, it cannot stand alone as a main clause because it does not make sense without additional information. But as long as we have that main clause with it, it does make sense. So it reads, they are playing music that I like to hear. Since it's describing, it's an adjective. Let's look at their second example. It says, we must stop skating when the music stops. If we just have we must stop skating, that could be a simple sentence all by itself. If we only look at the second part, which is when the music stops, it does not make sense because it does not give us additional information. That's why it needs the main clause. We must stop skating when the music stops. Since it's adding to our verb, it's an adverb. Now let's look at our third example. It says, I will tell you what happened at the rink. If we look at this first part, the main clause, it says, I will tell you, and it can stand alone as a simple sentence. If we look at the second half, and only the second half, it says, what happened at the rink? Since it isn't asking a question, it's stating something, we need additional information for it to make sense. So altogether, with the main clause, it makes sense. I will tell you what happened at the rink. And since it's talking about a place, it's a noun. Let's look at our exercise. It says, underline the main clause in the sentences. Write in the blank simple or complex to identify the type of sentence. So we're identifying the types of sentences. Let's look at 1 through 3 together after we look at our example together. Our example says February 2nd, or February 2, which is the midpoint of winter, is an unusual holiday. If we look at only the part that's between the commas, it says which is the midpoint of winter. Without additional information, that does not make sense. So which is the midpoint of winter is our subordinate clause. If we look at the rest of the sentence, February 2nd is an unusual holiday. That's our main clause because it makes sense and can stand alone as a sentence. Let's look at number 1. It says, it is Groundhog Day and is celebrated all over the country. By itself, it's a simple sentence. And we know that because if we find our verb, and put a line, we have one subject and we have a compound predicate. So we have a simple sentence. Now let's look at number 2. The groundhog, which is usually a woodchuck, emerges from hibernation on that day. Let's first take out and only look at the part of the sentence that's not between the commas. So it reads, the groundhog emerges from hibernation on that day. That stands alone as a sentence. So that's our main clause. Let's go ahead and underline the groundhog emerges from hibernation on that day. If we only look at the part in between the commas, which says, which is actually a woodchuck, it does not make sense without that additional information from the main clause. So this is a complex sentence. Let's look at number 3. It says, if the groundhog sees its shadow, there will be 6 more weeks of winter weather. Let's divide this up between what's before the comma and what's after the comma. If we read only the first part, if the groundhog sees its shadow, we're not given any additional information and it doesn't make sense. So that's a subordinate clause. Let's look at the second half. It says, there will be 6 more weeks of winter weather. That sentence can definitely stand by itself and helps make sense of the subordinate clause at the beginning of the sentence. So this as well is a complex sentence. At this point, I want you to go ahead and do 4 through 11. After you're finished, you need to make sure that your name is on your paper and you can turn it into the tray.